2, 1, and we are recording with Miss Lindsey Fitzharris, author of The Butchering Art, which, so we were just talking about other guests I've had on, and you were like, and now you're having on this silly book. And I was about to correct you, and I figured, fuck it, we're going to start recording. And there's a reason why I want to get this in is because, so I started this podcast December 12th, 2019. I read your book or listened to it that like the summer prior, and that may kind of sound like trivial, like okay, whatever. Now I listen to audiobooks. Like I'm my own boss. I choose my guests. I don't have any like team, and so I'm always listening to books now. Like I'm listening to probably 2 audiobooks a week now.
Oh,
but
wow.
Before the podcast, there was no reason for me to listen to anything unless I really wanted to. So that book, anyone that listens to this podcast kind of knows like another book I'm obsessed with, Raven Rock, about nuclear bunkers. And they also know that I've mentioned this book a million times, The Butchering Art. And to me, it's not just a silly book because it's something, the biggest compliment I can give is I listened to it before I started the podcast. So when
it is a huge compliment.
No, but seriously, it's from a time when I would listen to like 2 audiobooks a year. That was one of them. But please introduce.
You know what? The guy who read that book, his name is Ralph Lister. So, I mean, for people who are tuning in are like, why, what the hell is this book about? It's about this guy, Joseph Lister, who's a surgeon in the 19th century, and he changes fundamentally how we understand the body. And when they were sending me, because I'm not a voice actor and nobody wants to hear me read my own books. So they were sending me voice actors. And at first they were sending me female voices. And I said, it really feels like it needs to be a male voice because it's Lister's story. So they sent me this guy, Ralph Lister. And I said, well, wait a second, is he related to Joseph Lister? And they're like, oh, we'll ask. And the guy's like, oh yeah, he's a long-term, ancestor. I was like, well, I don't even care what he looks like. Yeah. Like he's got to do the book.
Yeah.
So I actually was joking on Twitter because my next book is about a guy named Harold Gillies, who is a surgeon who was rebuilding soldiers' faces during the First World War. And so this is kind of the origins of plastic surgery. And he has a very famous great nephew named Daniel Gillies, who's a Hollywood actor. And I tweeted that because Ralph Lister had done the audiobook for The Butchering Art, I needed a Gillies to do the next one. And he tweeted at me, he said, yeah, let's do this. So I don't know if it's going to happen, but this is going to be like a thing now. Every time I write a book about a famous figure, I'm going to have to find an ancestor to do the audiobook.
That's incredible. That is awesome, actually. And because I was going to say, as like an audiobook total nerd, to me, like a good narrator can make or break a story. Like a good book will always be a good book regardless, but a bad narrator can really fuck up a book. Before I keep going, for everyone listening, please introduce yourself. I introduced you as the woman that wrote The Butchering Art, but introduce yourself.
I am though. It's funny because when you asked me to be on this podcast, I thought, oh my gosh, it's been 4 years since I've written, since that book came out, and I've been 4 years in the trenches of World War I. And so I thought, oh God, I got to remind myself about The Butchering Art. But yeah, I'm a medical historian. I have a PhD in the history of science and medicine. I'm not the kind of doctor that can save your life, but I can tell you how people tried to save your life in the 19th century, which is what The Butchering Art is about. And I have a TV show on the Smithsonian called The Curious Life and Death of, which is about just kind of various deaths. So we did Harry Houdini, we did Brittany Murphy, all just kinds of mysterious deaths. Everybody does that show. So yeah, it's basically what I do. I'm a freelance writer, and I go around talking about how bad it was to live in the past.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love it. And I remember when I first decided to, I was like, because after a while, when I started the podcast, I was like, why don't I start interviewing authors? And like, as I've slowly gotten bigger guests, because I'm such a nerd about all this shit, that whereas I used to just kind of look up like obscure videos and stuff, now I'm like, I wonder if I can talk to them. And so it's kind of like this, it's this facade of like, I'm doing a podcast, and really I'm like, I just want to talk to this guy about, I'm like, what was it like to do that? And it's just, oh yeah, I'll videotape it, we'll call it a podcast. But really I'm just like, So to me, it's
I mean,
like,
we're out there, we're hiding under the rocks. You know, writers like to kind of hide away. I just did a virtual event 30 minutes ago with an author, and we were joking about like people romanticize this process. And I live in a very small village in Britain. And when I first moved here, a woman came and knocked on my door, and she was like, "Are you the writer?" You know, and I had like no makeup. I hadn't showered in days, and I was like, "Yeah." And she's like, "Oh, what you do is so romantic." I know. I was like this little creature crawling out. I was like, "There's nothing romantic about what I do." You know, I sit here in my head, you know, for years, and then eventually your publisher pushes you out into the limelight, and you have to kind of try to sell this to people and convince them that it's a story worth reading. So although I you know, I say, oh God, the butchering art again, you know, it's just been so incredible that people have connected with this book, and I feel really passionately that Lister's story should be better known. I'm trying to get it made into a movie, but that might be a pipe dream.
I think it could. I mean, so I've one of the guys I've interviewed is Dr. Ken Albeck, the first director of the Soviet Union bioweapon program, and I always have to put in the caveat, not that he wanted to, he was told to. In the Soviet Union,
Yeah.
he's you know he's he wanted to be a doctor and help people, and they're like, okay, look, what if instead of helping people, we put smallpox on the tip of a missile? And
Yeah.
you know, if you don't, your family's going to die in a gulag. So he defected to the U.S. in '92. Biggest intelligence coup ever. I've had him on. His daughter has autism, and now he's trying to cure autism. And this guy is brilliant.
Wow.
And
Yeah.
so, but he was talking to me, you know, early on, and now we've done a ton of podcasts about autism. And he has on guests whose kids have autism and how his treatment's working. And he's very, you know, he'll never. I've asked him like, "Do you want me to ask certain questions?" And he's always in a thick accent. He's always like, "No," you know, like put it down. But what he's saying is don't give me a leg up. Like shoot it down, tear it apart. And to me, I'm like, there's a guy that knows his shit. He's ready to defend it. And he said, you know, he's like a lot of people, you like to kind of laugh at this. And I actually brought up your book like the first time I talked to him. I was like, think about Joseph Lister. And obviously this guy knew his history. I was like, people are crazy until they're brilliant. And I was like, so there's a guy who's the head of the Soviet bioweapon program who I cited your book, and his face lit up, and he was like, "That's a good point." So it is, but so for to me, really, it's the first time I listened to it, it was just like the most disgusting thing I'd ever listened to, and I say that in the best way. It's just like a book of horror. I mean, truly, right? Just like what they're describing, and like the corpses and the sawdust, and like the you know, like the beds have like flowers growing on them because there's so much fungus and bacteria. And and you're just listening to this and you're like, Jesus. And I remember like was the guy who like sucks on like the blood or pus of some woman's neck and like spits it out. And you listen to this.
By the way, I tried to tell that story on NPR and they cut it. They were like, you can't say. So I love that you're bringing it up to your podcast audience, because that I feel like that story alone will, you know, get people to buy the butchering art.
It in. It's I remember. I vividly remember like pausing it and like telling my mom.
For people listening, basically there was this surgeon in the 19th century. This woman is brought in and she's asphyxiating on all this blood and pus that's gathered in her neck. And so he cuts into her trachea and all this pus and blood begins spilling out. And in this sort of inspired moment, he lowers his mouth onto it and he begins sucking this pus out. And he does it for like 5 mouthfuls. And the woman lives and he lives. And actually, for the purposes of the book, it would have been great if they both died because it was incredibly dangerous. But this is like, these are the stories that illustrate what it was like before Joseph Lister comes on and we understand germ theory and how, you know, actual infections spread. But before that, people didn't understand that. And as you say, there was a lot of pushback when Lister comes up with the idea of antisepsis and begins advocating germ theory. There is tons of pushback from within the medical community itself. You know, they just don't believe it. And people say, well, I can't understand why. But, you know, you imagine there's this young guy and he's telling you that there are these invisible little creatures and you have to believe me, they're killing your patient. I can see them with a microscope. And for lots of reasons, doctors weren't using microscopes at this time. And the other part of that was he was telling these doctors that they had been inadvertently killing their patients. And that was a really hard pill for them to swallow because nobody wants to think that they're kind of adding to the problem. And so we see this time and again in science and medicine. We see that when we're going to shift a paradigm, there's a lot of resistance at first. And so, and I think that it's really good that doctors and scientists read this book not just because of my bank account, because that would help me as a writer, but also because I think there's something to be said about keeping an open mind when it comes to new ideas, when it comes to medicine and science.
Yeah. And it is, and well, it's one of the things I point to, and it's also, who's it, Bruno, the astronomer that was burned at the stake. Like, there are these cases of like, yeah, not just pushback from the layman. You know, it's easy to look back at like your average guy in the streets in like Britain in like the 1800s. He's like, you know, like, hey, little germs in here. It's like, sure, but no, it was the heads of all these department heads, and not only, I mean, with everything involved, there's ego. So you have this clashing of like, you're telling me how to do this, but also it's, what do you do when it's not only are you telling me I'm wrong, you're telling me that me, a doctor, I potentially have been killing 90% of my patients. It's a huge moment of humility.
It's huge, and Lister really ultimately is victorious because he turns to the younger generation of surgeons and he teaches them about antisepsis, and they become known as the Listerians, and they go out and they spread the gospel of Lister. But it's a slow burn. So if I ever get this movie made, it's going to look like this Hollywood kind of, you know, it happens really fast, like within a year, but it's literally decades of change that he brings about. And it's not all linear. And we have to remember that progress in science and medicine isn't linear. You know, you take 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards. The other thing is that Lister got criticized because when he came out with his theories, he was always adjusting, you know, he was experimenting and adjusting his advice about how to use antisepsis. And surgeons would say, well, you're admitting you were wrong. But we would recognize that today as a scientific method in progress. So he's learning, he's adjusting. But they were using that as evidence that he was wrong. He didn't know what he was doing. So again, you know, within science and medicine, advice is going to constantly change. So you see that playing out in the butchering art a lot.
Yeah. And you see that, and then there's also guys who refuse. You can see the politicization of it, right? They're like, you know, if he mentions one thing about carboxylic acid, he's out. And it's like, even then you're like, I thought this was about medicine, and you're like,
no, it's not.
Apartment chairs. I mean,
yeah, the Lancet, which is like the lead medical journal even of its time in the 1960s, it's like a burn book. You know, it's essentially where doctors go to kind of burn each other. And a lot of times the doctor who was the best debater won. It didn't really necessarily have to do with the science or the facts behind it. It was like who was kind of the flashiest. I mean, some of these surgeons actually got into duels. Like they would have sword fights over, you know, these ridiculous arguments. So I think all of that's kind of swirling around Lister. And another background too is, you know, Lister, when I think about a movie, because I have that in my mind a lot, trying to kind of push forward with this idea, Lister is a Quaker, and he dresses very differently to the average person at this time. If anybody's seen Gangs of New York, you might think that that was kind of a fabrication of how they dressed, but actually early Victorians, they wore those like crazy colors and those plaids, lots of patterns. It's only when Victoria kind of plunges the nation into mourning that everybody kind of gets drab and black. You know, we think of the Victorians sort of wearing black and white. But actually a really colorful, and it was a very dirty world, and it was kind of circus-like. And the operating theater was filled to the rafters with ticketed spectators. I mean, people bought tickets to see this play out. So you can imagine this carnival atmosphere around Lister, who as a Quaker would actually be dressing very somberly. He would have not been wearing a lot of color because that was part of the religion at the time. So I like to think visually of this story as like, you can almost picture Lister as this kind of cleaner figure in the middle. And as the story progresses, it gets a bit more clean and more kind of black and white, more how we think of the Victorians. But one of the best compliments I got on this book, which wasn't meant to be a compliment on Amazon, but someone said, this book gets more boring as it goes on, because people aren't dying. Like no one's testicles are flying off, you know, sort of at the end of the book. Like Lister is victorious. He's telling people to slow down in the operating theater. He's telling people to clean up. So you don't get that kind of, you know, shock of the Victorian hospital at the end of the book than you do at the beginning. So the beginning might be a little bit more fun for people who like that kind of voyeuristic aspect of it.
Well, it's even like what we're talking about now, right? World War I. I mean, the trench, it starts with this massive clash, and then it settles into this, you know, the first month of World War I was more, for not to sound, you know, apathetic, but more entertaining, as just looking at it objectively. than the next 4 years, right?
Yeah. I mean, well, and the thing with World War One, I mean, there's so many crazy things about World War One that I learned. Like, for instance, these
Oh yeah.
guys were being sent into the trenches without any headgear at first. So
Oh, yeah.
there were a lot of, I mean, they were totally unprepared. A lot of them didn't realize that you couldn't look over the trenches and dodge the gunfire. So they were getting hit in the face at tremendous rates. But you know, things, as you say, like as World War One progresses too, medicine also gets better. So we get better at removing these guys from the trenches. But the irony is that we also get better at it and we prolong the war.
Yes.
Because we're essentially medically being able to return these men and feed that war machine. So it's this really terrible, vicious cycle. But yeah, I think with the butchering art, with the Victorian hospitals, certainly like at the end, people are like, oh no, they feel so sanitized now. It's not as entertaining as it kind of was at the beginning when the maggots were growing in the sheets and, you know, things like that people love.
But that's what that is. But to me, that shows exactly what your point is, right? I mean, I go to the hospital now and it's very, you know, just quiet. You hear like a phone ringing, there's fluorescent lighting. Please come in. You know, it's Mr. Carrigan, how you doing? Wait. But that's what it was supposed to be. And you can almost see this like this weird symbolism of things getting cleaner, like you said, like representing like germ theory. In the beginning, it's just this crazy, you know, everyone's wearing these brightly colored, just like 3-piece, you know, carnival guys. And then it finally settles into like, dip your gloves, dip the tubing into like carboxylic acid, you know, go slowly. Not everything needs to be a surgery, like slow it down. But just for the sheer entertainment value, that's another thing. And I wanted to get to this that I love about it. There's something about me and my buddy Cal in college, fall 2009, we were in our dorm rooms. And I remember we'd laugh so hard. We'd get like a bottle of vodka, be playing Mario Kart, and we'd laugh so hard at the fact that, like, you know, Andrew Jackson like beat the shit out of his would-be assassin with a cane. Just this kind of like different level of just these old kind of wild-eyed, like Teddy Roosevelt, you know, like where's the quote, like death came and got Teddy in his sleep, because if he was awake, he would have fought. Like,
there's crazy, like you think about that, like there's a guy, one of the men in Lincoln's cabinet, I'm going to tell this story and people probably going to correct me, so I'm trying to remember, but he was also attacked during the assassination attempt in his bed, but he like fought back in this wild and crazy, and he ended up shattering his jaw. That's the reason why I know that story, because I deal a little bit in the next book with Civil War kind of reconstruction stuff, but it was this insane story. You think, wow, like to get out of bed, someone's stabbing you and you're like fighting this guy with a cane and a monocle. I mean, what was going on in the 19th century?
But that's what I mean. There's a guy I've had on, an Air Force colonel who wrote a book about like early surveillance, and like towards the end of the Civil War, like the first guys going up in hot air balloons, and like every once in a while, like I think one guy, and it wasn't in the United States in the Civil War, but it was in France, but they were going over some enemy line, or I don't know, remember one, it might have been, no, Napoleon was too early. Point is there was a French guy and I think a British guy, and they were up on this janky hot air balloon, right, in their stupid 3-piece suits, and they shot like a cannonball, and the guys, like comically, they actually ducked and it went over them, and they stood back up and looked both ways, and apparently they held up the middle finger and said like "Vive la France." But it was like, you can see the birth of the sort of the fighter jet jock pilot Top Gun. You can see the birth of it, but there's just this whole image of just these crazy guys in the 19th century, and that's what I love about the butchering art. Is at the beginning, I get this image, and that's why you do need to make it in a movie. Is I always laugh because it's like just these guys. Big
there's
suits.
A level, I mean, my husband, who's a caricaturist, he's always like going on about like, you know, these British explorers that would climb Everest with like, you know, a 2-piece suit and a smile. And you're like, what, how did they even survive? And you definitely get, I mean, in World War I, these pilots that were going up, now they're going up just, you know, a few years after the Wright brothers, so these planes are very rudimentary. They're bringing pistols up there. They're bringing pistols for what? You know, and you get these just absolutely insane stories about these pilots going up there. And I think they called themselves the 20-minute club because that was about how long you probably survived in air before being shot down. And again, you know, for the purposes of my next book, I'm talking about the injuries that occur from these horrific plane crashes. But yeah, I mean, the Civil War, and then you see in the 19th century. So a lot of people, when I talk about the butchering art, they think about the Civil War, because now Lister, he comes up with his antisepsis and germ theory, and they should be doing that in the Civil War, but they're not. It hasn't quite made it over to America. And so they're still packing wounds with mud in some cases. And the infection rates were just out of control. I mean, these surgeons were literally sewing these men's fate up when they were sewing these wounds up without cleaning them properly. So they would become septic. And if you become septic, that travels, if it gets into the bloodstream, I mean, you're gone. Yeah. And I like to remind people too, that we still, you know, people still die of septicemia today. They still die of these conditions, but the difference is that we understand how they spread. So we're better able to proactively prevent it, and certainly better able to treat it. Now, if you don't understand germs, this is a very dangerous situation. And that's what we see time and again. So imagine going into the operating theater, operating on a patient, and they die and they die and they die. It would be very frustrating. Some people out there might have seen the show The Nick on Showtime, which was with Clive Owen. It was brilliant. And it was about a hospital in 1900. So I always say the butchering art is the prequel to the Nick. So whatever you think of, you know, how bad it was in the Nick, this is a lot worse, because by the time the Nick comes around and Clive Owen's character comes around, they understand germs. So there's still an attempt to kind of sanitize the environment. They still don't know 100% what they're doing. And the interesting thing about the Nick is that character is based off a surgeon named Halstead, who was a real person. And he was a cocaine addict. I mean, he was so high on cocaine all the time. This guy, and this is where we get this kind of hangover of the machoism of surgery and how surgeons will like basically work themselves to death, because Halstead, he would unsurprisingly work all the time. He was high on coke all the time. I mean, the guy had a real serious problem, and everybody was trying to kind of keep up with Halstead's schedule. And so that's a real hangover from that kind of era. But these surgeons, they were testing, you know, these drugs. They were discovering and testing the stuff on them. The butchering art begins with the discovery of ether, anesthesia, and we get that phrase ethereal experiences, because these guys were like, they were drinking it and they were sniffing it and they were trying it out on themselves. And so it was this really weird, unregulated time in medicine where something's discovered and everybody kind of gets onto it, and nobody knows how safe it is until it's kind of too late.
But that's what I fucking love so much about it, is there's just this mad imagery of like, everyone's got their tickets and it's like, all right, and we're gonna start, and it's just, you hold him down so he can't scream, and like the one patient runs to the bathroom and the surgeon goes out and he's like, throws him down. I was listening to it again because I listened to it again for this podcast, and he's like, held him down and like, you know, put one line like up his urethra and another one, and I was literally doubled over on my bed doing laundry. It was just like, I forgot. I was like, he's like, all of it, but then you hear it's like, and done in 60 seconds, and you're like, well, that was the sort of brutality before there was, you know, before
it was. I mean, you had to be fast because this for anesthesia. So the story he's telling is Robert. There was a guy named Robert Liston, who, not to be confused with Lister, but Liston he was 6'2", he was really tall, and he was really strong, and he could hold you down with his left arm and take off your leg in under 30 seconds, which is exactly what you wanted when there was no anesthesia. Yeah. And he got into these like almost comical. It's funny because, you know, the 19th century is long ago enough that we can kind of like look at this, like how crazy it was. It gets different, like the tone and the way I feel about stories like the World War I stuff is like much more somber, because, you know, it shouldn't be that way. Like everything's awful. Like getting your testicles sliced off in the 19th century was awful.
All of the world is hell. Just I know, it's all hell.
Stories, but it's like there's a different, I think there's a different feel for my next book, but this one with the butchering art, like there's definitely like almost like a comedic aspect to Robert Liston, that character, because he does get into these. I mean, you read these stories and you think, how did this guy continue to operate? Because in one story, as you were saying, there's this patient who's brought onto the table, and the patient looks at him and thinks, I'm not going through this. So he jumps off the table, he runs across the room, he locks himself in a closet. Robert Liston, remember, big guy for Victorian period, chases after him, rips the door off the hinges, drags this guy back. And there's like a ticketed audience like watching this. So there is something outrageous about this, in the 19th century. And it's sometimes you have to remind yourself, like, oh my God, like that was a real person. And, that really happened. And also to Liston's credit, as kind of comedic as some of his mishaps are, it must have been horrible for him. Like, I mean, can you imagine going into the operating theater? You're going to be watched, you have this reputation, and you have to fight against a patient who is literally fighting you. The whole thing would have been awful for sort of everybody involved. But one of the famous stories about Liston, which may, it's one of those stories that circulates. So all the details are kind of like, a little bit obscure, but he was so fast that he had this patient on the table. And as he was operating, he was switching knives, and he would hold these bloody knives in his mouth, just to underline just how unhygienic this was. And as he was switching knives, he took off his assistant's finger, and then as he's switching knives, he sliced the coat of a spectator behind him. And it was said that the patient died of gangrene, the assistant died of gangrene, and the spectator died of shock. He must have had like some kind of stroke or something from this experience. And so it's jokingly referred to as the only operation with a 300% mortality rate. So I love Robert Liston in this book because he is this kind of, crazy character, and he really represents the old guard of surgery. Whereas you then have Joseph Lister, who is this kind of somber, quiet, methodic, surgeon who comes along, and he's trying to change this kind of carnival aspect of surgery in the 19th century. And he does do it, thank goodness. But it was definitely an uphill battle for him.
But it's like the Chucky Yeager and like the Bell X-1, the first plane to break the sound barrier. No one knew what was going to happen, and there was no drone, so they're like, fuck it, who wants to hop in there? You get in there and you're just like, do this shit.
Well, look at the space stuff now. I'm like, I wouldn't be going up in the first, privatized. I mean, people are really brave to do that on some level. I mean, this is human nature. Like, we all kind of want to be the first, but also, in terms of these patients who undergo these surgeries, you have to imagine they are in a very desperate situation because to put yourself in the hands of someone knowing that you're likely to die. And by the way, your chances of dying probably went up depending on where you fell in the day. So if you're like the last patient, you're going in, the operating table is not going to be clean, because they didn't wash their hands between patients. They didn't wash their instruments. Now people go, well, that seems crazy. But remember, if you don't understand germs, it makes no sense to wash your hands because your hands are just going to get dirty with the next patient. So why would you spend time? This is, washing your hands. You'd have to go find clean water. That would be a whole process. You want to get patients in and out. So if you imagine you're the last patient in the line, out of maybe 10 that day, that table is going to be filthy. Those instruments are going to be filthy. It would have been just awful. Now, if you ever make it to London, you got to go to the Old Operating Theatre in London. It's the second oldest in the world. I always like to mention it because small museums are great places, but they have the table that they think Liston performed the first operation under ether on. And when you see the table, you're going to go, wow, Victorians were really small. But actually, the table is designed because the Victorians were geniuses. They loved science and engineering. It's designed in a way so it's very low to the ground. Now, the reason is because if you have a table sort of here, if people imagine like I'm pointing sort of high up, you have to use your body strength to get a leg off. So you're going to want to push downwards and you're going to push your weight into the sawing motion. So the table is going to have to be low enough so that you can do that to facilitate speed. The other thing is that table has all kinds of things like parts of it come out to make it longer. So people weren't necessarily smaller, although they probably were a little bit smaller at this time. The Industrial Revolution hits, diets kind of get worse. So we get a little bit smaller in the sort of late 19th century. Incidentally, it's totally a myth. In the 18th century, we were taller. George Washington was 6'2". Yeah. People always think of, of Lincoln, but actually, Washington was also quite tall. So everything in the operating theater was designed to facilitate speed, and they were really thinking about how to save patients. They weren't necessarily good at saving patients, but that was the goal. It wasn't meant to be torturous and horrible. And I always like to remind people that it was horrible, probably mentally, for the surgeons themselves. And if you do watch the Nick, you'll see that psychological impact, that it has on the doctors going into that operating theater and losing patients all the time.
Yeah, and I was thinking about this the other day, like, like those old videos of like the 1920s, like racetracks, and there's like no fencing. They're just standing on the side of the track, and like a car will lose its like balance and like fly into the crowd, and it's like 10 dead.
Yeah.
And you're just like,
yeah.
But so I was thinking about that. I was thinking about it yesterday. I was thinking about obviously the patients, right? They're in between a rock and a hard place. They have to have the surgery, but kind of other stuff. Like these doctors that would take the ether, take the cocaine, the laudanum, just like, fuck it, let's see what happens. Use a candle.
Yeah.
Don't get the wax on the patients. Go for it. Like, you hear about that and you think, well, what drives them to it? And you got to think, well, what's the alternative? We look right now, why would you want to go to space? Well, is it 100% fatal? Well, no, but there's a chance. Okay. As opposed to, what, you're just going to go to your everyday, your 9 to 5? Like, we all die eventually. If a lot of these guys are going, fuck it, I might try to go walk on the moon. I mean,
and thank goodness for people who push the boundaries. We definitely need figures like that. I mean, if you look to it back into the 19th century and even before, people were experimenting with this stuff because you could, like, it was readily available. But also, I should just add, people say, oh, didn't they give you brandy before ether? Or they give you some alcohol. They didn't actually do that as much as people think, because it thins your blood. So you don't want the patient to be kind of deliriously drunk. So in most cases, you were pretty awake, you were pretty aware. They also thought when ether came out that it could be dangerous, because they believed that what kept you alive was the shock of it, that it would keep your heart going very quickly. And they came to this conclusion. A lot of doctors came to this conclusion because in battle, they noticed that soldiers were more likely to survive an amputation if it was sort of in the heat of the battle, like in the moment, because their adrenaline's pumping, it's keeping the heart going. So they did worry that maybe anesthesia would lead to more deaths. And actually, ironically, it does lead to more deaths, but not in that way. It's because anesthesia comes before germ theory. So suddenly you no longer have to fight your patient. So you're more willing to pick up the knife. You're more willing to go deeper into the body, but you don't understand germs. And so suddenly postoperative infections rise. So the butchering art starts with the discovery of anesthesia, because I think that when people think of the history of medicine, they tend to kind of think of those moments. But actually, things got a lot worse immediately following the advent of anesthesia, because germs weren't understood yet. But again, we needed the Halsteads, the cocaine, Halsteads, who were, he develops the radical mastectomy, and he's always pushing the boundaries, and Lister's pushing the boundaries. And, these men, they don't always get it right, but they are pushing the boundaries in these periods. And as a result, they're fundamentally shifting the ways we kind of understand health and medicine today.
And I guess we'd have to go back to that time to be like, why are they doing this insane shit? And obviously, like, we always have to, like, thank God for the people that push the borders. Like, that's why we're not, still hunter gatherers, right? But there's also just this sort of like alternative, like in 200 years, they're probably gonna, or maybe even in our lifetimes with self-driving cars, they're gonna be like, why did anyone used to get in cars? And we go, well, what, I think there's 36,000 fatalities a year in the United States on roads out of 350 million, right? So that's 2 per state per day. Okay. They might go, well, why would you ever get in a car? Why would you go near a road? Well, come back to 2021. What? Yeah. Am I just not going to go visit my friend? Am I not going to go to the bar and get some drinks? Like, am I not going to go to drive to Walmart? I think that if you want and put yourself back in that mindset, there's almost this sort of like, no one's living forever. And now as we get to radical life extension, someone might, but like, there's a certain point of like, hey man, whether it's on the operating table or whether it's, when I get hit by a horse in a week, I think there's this general sort of fuck it, right? It's just this,
Well, I mean, and as you said, I mean, life was really cheap back then. So,
Yeah.
people were, as you say, like, the 10 people suddenly die from this kind of crazy accident. And we live in a culture of like extreme safety now,
Yeah.
and people expect it. And, there's a lot of pros to that. But people in the 19th century, they didn't have an expectation of being kept safe necessarily. And of course, we have to remember too that the patients whose bodies that medicine was being built on were largely the bodies of the poor people, because these hospitals, if you were wealthy or if you were middle class, you didn't go into these hospitals because your chances of not coming out were quite high. So if you had enough money, your surgeon would come to your house and you would have your operation on your own dining room table, perhaps, and you probably were more likely to survive it, even though that sounds crazy to us. But these places were for the poor. And so if you were poor and you were desperate, you would go in. Sometimes you would prepay for your burial because it was so expected you were going to die in these institutes. And it was those people who a lot of these experiments were made on. And on top of it, it was those people whose bodies went unclaimed and that the medicine got to dissect and to learn from. And those are all important parts to acknowledge about medicine. It's kind of like the darker side of medicine, but that's certainly what's going on in Lister's time.
And I want to touch on that in a second. I was gonna say just before I forget. Oh, fuck, what was I gonna say? I think I did forget. Damn it! I had a point. It was right there, and I was gonna. Well, I can't.
You can't think about it because
God, this is gonna drive me crazy. No, I did. Because I meant to say it earlier. When you look back at World War I and you look at how this was way earlier, when we look at, kind of how dark it is and much more somber it is versus like you look at the Victorian era, it's almost like this uncanny valley. It's like World War I is too close. Like there are still videos of it. There's no sound. And we go, oh, that's bad. You look at 9/11, you go, it's terrible. But then we go back to Victorian England and it's just like, doing cocaine and chopping people up. And everyone's just like doing a golf clap.
I mean,
and
that was going on in like 1950. We would probably not have this. It's like my favorite British comedian over here, David Mitchell, has this YouTube show called Soapbox, and he does this kind of thing about, if it happened really long ago, it can be funny almost, but like if it happened recently, it's not funny. And there isn't, like, I just want to be clear, there's nothing funny about, these people dying in the 19th century, but there is something, like I said, like Robert Liston, there's almost like a comedic aspect to it because it's so far removed from our own experiences about what medicine is like. Whereas World War I, this next book, it's not just about the doctors, it's about these boys. Let's face it, some of these men were as young as 16 and they were going out into these trenches. They had no idea what they were getting into and they were getting their faces blown off. And I don't say that lightly. I mean, I've looked at their photographs and their horrific stories. So, and then on top of it, actually generationally, we're not that far removed from these men. In fact, so much so that I had to prove that these guys were dead to access their patient files in the archives, which was crazy because I thought, like, what if I had found out one of these guys was still alive? There's like no way, right? Yeah. But I still had to produce death certificates and things like that to kind of get access to these records. So it's one of those things. I mean, the butchering art is a fun story. And I say that even though it's like an incredibly gruesome story. And, there's some people who will pick it up and it's just not their cup of tea because it's just too visceral. But I always say that I would not be doing justice to the patients who endured these operations if I wasn't explaining exactly what that was like to get on that table. I mean, this was not a pleasant, this was your last chance. If you're on that table, this is your last chance. And really, these patients were very brave themselves to undergo these surgeries. In fact, I talk about how Lister performs a mastectomy on his own sister on his own dining room table, again, talking about how to, control infection rates. And for him to have to do that, I mean, imagine having to operate on your own sister, but he's the only one who can do it at that time because he's the only one who's operating with this antiseptic method. So he trusts himself to do it. And I won't tell readers what happens there, but, I think that this is what makes Lister's story so compelling. He's a man who he's the right man at the right moment. And I think we see this a lot in history. If anybody's seen that movie Lincoln, I don't know if you've ever seen that movie Lincoln, but there's a really great moment, which is fictitious, I'm sure, but it was a great moment where he's talking to a sort of underling, and he says, do you think that we're fitted for the times? And the boy answers, I do think we're fit. He goes, I don't know if we're fitted for the times, but I think you might be fitted for the times. It's something like that. And I think that was perfect, because Lincoln was the right person at the right time. And when you unpack everything that was kind of going on, you can't really imagine someone else, accomplishing what he was able to accomplish in that short period in the same kind of way. And I think Lister is very much the right person at the right time. His father gives him a microscope when he's a boy. He's scientifically minded. He's open to that. He goes on to medical school. He's curious in a way that maybe other surgeons aren't. This is a time when surgeons are very much handymen, basically. They're men who work with their hands. It's not a respected profession in the way that it is today. But he's curious, he's scientific, he comes across Louis Pasteur's germ theory, he starts piecing this puzzle together. And you have to wonder, how long would it take for us to solve that mystery if Lister hadn't been in that position at that time?
Yeah. Yeah. And on the comedic front, well, it's like that saying, right? Tragedy plus time time is comedy. And it's, you look back at it, you can't help, right? It's like looking at, slaves building the pyramids. It's just 100 guys pulling up like a block and it slips and then they're done. And it's like, next, like there's something comedic about that.
There's no way to, it has to do, like, we can't like relate to these events, I think. And and also you probably have guessed just from talking to me, I'm not someone who really takes myself seriously. So I like to kind of find the funny, aspects of these stories. And, but the delight is, I tell people, a lot of people don't like history, and I get it. Like, you remember like your boring history teacher in school, but, I think that people who hate history might still like medical history, because we all know what it's like to be sick. So where I come in, I can tell you, what happened if your teeth were rotting in the 18th century, which was the case with George Washington, or what would happen if you broke your leg in 1832. So I get to kind of fill in that universal experience. We can imagine what that's like, because we've all been there. We've been to the dentist, and then you think, ooh, yeah, the dentist is a great thing to be able to go to in 2021. What would happen in 1872 if I had to go get my teeth checked? What would they end up doing for me? And actually, to go back to World War I found out that a majority of the soldiers didn't own toothbrushes, even in 1914. When this war began. I know, and they had their teeth were in such a bad state. And what was interesting was that in the 19th century, teeth in the army were taken more seriously, because you had to bite the cartridges open. So they would say an army that can bite can fight. But after that, because like the weaponry changes and stuff, it becomes less important. So you get to World War I, and their teeth, like, nobody really cares about their teeth at that point. So in the story that I'm going to tell, you have a horrible situation where men are getting hit in the face. They have bad teeth as it is. So you have a lot of bacteria, and you don't have any dentists at the beginning of the war. So there is a dentist who appears in the story, and he is like, you're going to love this guy, because he had this Rolls Royce. He was independently wealthy, and he retrofitted it with a dental chair. Jeez. And he drove it to the front under a hail of bullets.
To me, that's just as funny as the butchering art. It's just this crazy fucking dentist. There's biplanes whirring around, and it's just, I know. And his Rolls Royce still exists. It actually went up for auction, I think in the last like 10 years or something. But yeah, it's a wild story. So he's sort of one of my favorite quote. I use the word characters. These are all real people, but he's definitely one of those people that you look at in awe, because you think, oh my gosh, like the sacrifices you made. And he also never charged for any of his services during the war. So he's a really incredible person that will be featured in the book. But there is something like funny in that, though. It's I guess if we can pinpoint what the humor is it's like, it's not just Victoria. It's this general like laughter in the face of just like overwhelming despair and technological incompetence, whether it's Lister or whether it's driving your Rolls Royce into World War I with horses running around and doughboys and Maxim machine guns.
I know.
And you're like, fuck it, who needs a root canal? Like, there's something hilarious about. But the pilots that after World War II started flying into hurricanes, and they're like, let's see what's in these. Like,
It's honestly, I mean, when you think of, but again, I go back to, Bezos going into, I mean, everything we're doing right now, it's
same
that
shit.
human nature to kind of just throw yourself into these really dangerous situations. And to what end, we don't know. But the point is that a lot of positive generally comes out of these things.
Yes.
What is space exploration going to open for us at this time? We don't know yet. So, I'm always open to those possibilities. And I do look at these stories in awe, but it is like the guys who climbed Everest, with a tweed jacket and a smile. And, just like, what were they thinking?
Yeah.
You see people climbing Everest today with all this kit, and you just think of these early explorers going up there, and it's just wild. And there's so many stories like that from history, and they're all incredible.
Like Curtis LeMay in World War II, they realized that the anti-aircraft guns on the Japan main island were all calibrated for 30,000 feet. So they were like, let's just start flying at 5,000 feet. Hey, what a gamble.
Yeah.
and it worked.
Yeah. I mean, these blimps too in World War I. I mean, imagine how courageous or stupid or both you'd have to be to get into something like that. These huge hydrogen filled, blimps. And there were all kinds of horrible accidents. And there's one story I tell in the book where a pilot is seen going after this Zeppelin in the air, and the spotlights in London are trailing his plane as he kind of goes up to take this thing down. And he does ultimately take it down, and he was awarded the Victoria Cross, I think within 48 hours of this event happening. So it was another incredible event. So, you get these stories, and this is what I love about these periods is, bringing this to life in a way that, people think, oh, World War I is quite boring. I know about that. And I know about, the Civil War. I know about Victorian surgery, but there's so many real life drama that plays out in these. And that's what I love bringing to life.
I'm just thinking about the imagery of that. You're World War I, you're just at night, you're just out there with your friend. There's no TV,
right.
And the spotlights are just tracking a biplane going to take out a blimp, which is probably looks like some mythical god. It's so big.
I know. I mean, remember in Indiana Jones when they had the blimp, in the third one? I mean, those were really frightening looking machines. Yeah. And imagine these kind of going over. Now, obviously, people think of World War II with the Blitz, but there was a bombing campaign by the Germans of London in World War I. It's not on the same scale, but yeah, they were sending these Zeppelins over London, and they were killing a lot of people. And so they had to figure out how to take these things down. And these planes are so rudimentary. I mean, they're not really built to take something like that down. And so I talk about in the book the sort of how they unravel that mystery of how, where to hit the Zeppelin to make that happen. But one of the challenges was these little planes didn't go that high up into the air. And so, yeah, I mean, these pilots that went up there, and when I said earlier that they carried pistols, they did carry pistols. Maybe for ridiculous reasons, like today we would recognize as ridiculous reasons, but they also carried pistols because if they were going down, they knew they weren't going to survive. And so it was, in case you wanted to take yourself out before you kind of hit the ground. And obviously some of these men do survive their crashes and are terribly burned and feature in the book. I shouldn't really be talking too much about this book yet.
I know. I fucking love it. No, I'm thrilled by this. I'm just, to me, it all sounds like it's just as insane. There is the tweed coat on Mount Everest that.
So I'll have to come back, and talk to you about that. Maybe Daniel Gillies will do the audio too, and I'll get my dream of getting an ancestor or getting someone whose ancestor is in the book to read the book. So we'll see if that happens.
You have to. For Butchering Art, it's on Audible. Tell everyone where to get it. This has kind of been the running theme of 600 episodes is I have the smallest bladder in the world, so I have to go to the bathroom. Just tell everyone where to find. It's on Audible. Tell them where else to find it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm alone now on the podcast, but you guys can pick up the book really anywhere: Barnes and Noble, Amazon. It's kind of everywhere now. And as a writer, it's always appreciated if you want to pick up the book. And it's really been my delight and joy to bring Lister's story to life, because I think it's just a really important story that everybody should know. And I could go on and on while he's going to the bathroom about why I think medical history is important, but you probably don't want to hear that lecture, but it is, Tommy has been chasing me to do this podcast. In fact, I think the last couple emails, the heading said, "Are you alive?" Because I had disappeared for such a long time because I've been editing the manuscript and then copy edits, and it's a whole process. And so I finally said, yes, I'm alive. And, we should talk about the butchering art. So I'm really glad that I was able to come on today. I guess we're going to find out how long this takes.
You survived.
I survived. Yeah. I said that you've been chasing me to go on the podcast for so long. You've actually started to write emails like, "Are you alive?" And I'm like, I'm just trying to finish this book. And it's fun. I do so few podcasts these days because I've just been trying to focus on the book. And also it's like, I actually was worried about going on today because, like I said, the book came out in 2017. So I think, do I remember everything about that? Sounds crazy because it takes, obviously you spend a lot of time writing a book. Yeah, I've kind of switched, as you guys have probably been able to hear in this podcast. I've switched into World War I mode, so that's very much in my mind at the moment.
Yeah, no, not at all. I mean, in 2013, I got into medical school. I couldn't pass a test if my life depended on it right now, and it's no, I get it. No, it's and you are one of the people I've pursued, and I remember I was like, when I was trying to find you originally, I was like, and I found you and you're on Joe Rogan, and I was like, motherfucker, like, to me that's not good because I'm like, damn it, they're on that one. How high I have to get if I find someone and they're not on Rogan, and I'm like, okay, I have a shot. But you were on Rogan.
Well,
I was
I'll tell you what, he invited me on, and I have never been so nervous to go on a podcast because I thought, oh my gosh, like a 3 hour conversation, like where is this going to go? But it was great. It was a very easy conversation, and a lot of people found my book through that. So I'm hugely indebted about that. But yeah, it's always a little nerve-wracking when you go on a podcast because you never know like the direction it's going to go or anything.
Yeah,
but
as you can tell, this one has virtually no direction, and it's seeing as how your mind's on World War One. I would love to keep talking about it. Obviously, I'll get it, I'll read it, I'll have you back on for that. But yeah, without spoiling it, just so what did your research lead to you doing this? So you go from the butchering art, you go from these crazy guys with a monocle and a top hat, these steampunk assholes drinking cocaine and morphine, just chopping up babies, and they're like, "Boy," and just the next one. What leads
to... it's funny because I pitched several ideas to my publisher, and they really zeroed in on this book about Harold Gillies. And I have to say that I didn't know much about Gillies at all going into it, but I knew, I'm a historian and I have a PhD, but I like to call myself a storyteller, and I know a good story when you could feel it, as a storyteller. And I knew that Gillies was going to be a good story, but I didn't know, that's like basically all I knew. And so they said, yes, that book. And so I thought, shit, now I gotta start from zero. And zero literally was like, let's go back to the basics. Why did World War I even break out? Like, how did all of this start? So it's been a real journey. And the other challenge has been that World War I there's so much written about it. And these soldiers were writing letters and diaries. There's so much material. In the 19th century, one of the problems is you don't have enough material. In cases, especially when it comes to the patient experience. Here, you just have just so much material. And so one of my jobs as a narrative nonfiction writer is to kind of weed through that and to give the most gripping, sort of fast-paced story I can get without it being too technical. And another issue too is like plastic surgery in World War I, because it starts to mirror what we're doing today to some extent, so that the language becomes more technical. So I had to really read through all this medical lingo, try to understand what Gillies was doing. He's literally rebuilding people's faces. So it's been challenging, but I'm excited. I can't really say much more about like when it's coming out or the title, but I'm going to be releasing that stuff soon. So I'll ping you an email and then you can share it with people if they're interested. I know. I wish I could say it because I got a really good title too. I think you guys like. It took me 4 years to figure out the title. So when I come on to do the podcast for that book, we can talk about all of this.
Killing me. It is an odd thing though, right? And it's again, and I know we're on. Like I can talk to you forever. I know we're on wildly different time zones. So if you need to go, you just let me know. I don't care. You can't hurt my feelings.
Well, I have to go soonish, but because I haven't eaten. I did a virtual event, but
tell me how much longer you can go.
What time is it?
Literally whatever you want.
like another 5 minutes? Is that
5 minutes?
cool?
Let's do it. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
yeah, no, that's the other thing is I've zero feelings with this. And I love when a guest just like they pick me up on that and they're just like, hey, I gotta go. And I'm like, all right, cool, peace. Like that's no bullshit. No, just pull the Band-Aid off. Like I can go. Oh, thank you very much.
I was worried about the bathroom thing with the Rogan podcast because I was like, oh my God, how am I going to make it like for 3 hours
You
of
just
this? But
hold up a middle
fun.
finger and say I have to go to the bathroom.
Well, they
you?
told me, they said, oh, if you have to, and I thought, oh, that would be weird. But now I've seen someone do it in live time. Just get up and go to the bathroom.
I literally have done it with every. I've done it with every. I think I didn't do it with Charlie Duke, who walked on the moon. I think with him, I held it in. With
Listen, with the next book, I got to make it the podcast so gripping that you will not take a bathroom break. That's going to be like my goal.
Now I'm going to die because my bladder's going to explode and die of sepsis.
I'm going to remind you, cut out fluids 3 hours before we talk.
Absolute nonsense. Speaking of fluids, what is SM Novella? For everyone listening on the screen, there's 2 bottles next to you.
Oh God, yeah. No, I was doing an event with an author named Catherine Prendergast. In her book, The Gilded Edge is about this love triangle in the 20th century that ends in cyanide poisoning. So I just have these kind of poison bottles, but these bottles here, they're from Italy, and there's like this pharmacy that sells these. I don't know what they do. I think they're.
I thought you had like your own like liquor line and you just had it like prominently there. I was like, well, I'll plug it. Yeah.
No, or maybe it's like Halstead with the cocaine. Like maybe I try it and we figure out what the hell it is. But no, it was just like for the effect of the virtual event I was doing because her book is about poisoning. And so I put out the poison bottles. I have lots of like crazy stuff. I mean, you could see there's a Lister like 19th century microscope behind me, and there's no human remains. Like those are all replicas carved by this guy named Zane Wiley. He sells them online and stuff. But yeah, I got lots of weird stuff. I used to do a YouTube channel called Under the Knife, and so I have like so many props.
No, I was just wait. Can you put your hand on the bottle again?
This one?
Okay, I thought it was close up. I thought it was the size of like a liquor bottle, and I'm now looking at it's perception. Like, no, it's a tiny little. I thought you had these. I wasn't sure if you just had like your own liquor line. I was like, that's cool.
No, but that would be amazing. I'm a big gin fan. Maybe I need to kind of make my own like medicinal gin line. It
kind of looks like
to drink medicinally as well. But yeah, like I have a YouTube episode on the medieval urine wheel, which is back here. It was in the medieval time, they had these urine wheels that told the different colors of urine, and it would tell you, what was wrong with you. And so I took that wheel, and it's pretty small, but I put it way up in front of the camera, and then I stood way behind it, and it looked like a wheel of fortune. And so I'm spinning it. It's ridiculous, but yeah, the camera angles make everything.
I was so confused.
Smaller or bigger.
Well, it looks like some Victorian era, like again, you can imagine just swigging that and chopping people up.
And then this is an actual Victorian bottle, and it says poison on the top. Usually when they were this kind of cobalt blue, it signified that it was probably not something you should drink. I did an episode on The Curious Life and Death about Lizzie Borden, if you remember.
Yeah, Lizzie Borden had an axe, killed her. Yeah, gave her mother 40 bucks.
In this episode, we had these ballistic gel bodies that I would we would shoot up and do all kinds of weird things. So this is the first episode. This is my first TV show I've ever hosted. And they hand me an axe and they're like, okay, so you have to replicate these murders because we need to see how much force is used and how much blood would end up on you. Because when Lizzie Borden, when the police arrived, there's no blood on her. So we're like, how does she do that if she did these murders? So they hand me this axe, and then the director is like, it's a weapon. That's what he says to me. And he goes, and don't let it slip and hit you in the leg, and good luck. And that was like kind of like the level of, that's what it was, just like, go at it. And by the way, if you're going to kill somebody, don't use an axe. It takes a lot of work. I could not believe how much force it took to crack through the skull of this ballistic body. It was insane. And at one point, actually, the director said, oh, do we need someone to come in and, crack the skull and then you can walk? I said, no, I have to be able to do it, because the point was that people didn't believe a woman could do this crime. And there was a Scotland Yard detective who's in the show. His name's Brian. And I said, it is really hard. And I said, Lizzie Borden was really small. And he said, yeah, I've seen people do a lot worse, when the adrenaline's pumping. So
Yeah.
it's different when you're just kind of like on set trying to replicate something, different when it's, so it was fun, I'll put in quotes, to replicate the Lizzie Borden murders, talk about, inappropriately dealing with the past, but it's a wild story. And for people who don't totally remember it, there was that rhyme: Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks,
which is all she had done.
Yeah,
gave her father 41. Yeah.
Yeah, and what I found out in the process of filming this episode was that later in life, I mean, she was acquitted because these Victorian men who were on her jury just could not fathom this woman of this sort of high class standing being able to do something like that. But there was a lot of evidence that she could have done it. She certainly had the motive. We could debate whether she burned the dress that she was wearing on the day of the murders, which seemed really suspicious, but she said, well, she'd gotten paint on it, and so she burned it, and that was something Victorians did. They would get rid of their clothes, they would burn them sometimes. But there was a lot of reasons, I think, to believe that she could have definitely done this. But if she did it, this was the part that I found so creepy. If she did it, when she died, she requested that she be buried next to her stepmother and her father, and she is indeed buried there. So, I mean, if she did it, that is levels of, psychopath that I don't even want to contemplate. I don't know if she did it because she just thought, like, everybody's whispering behind the backs of their hands that I did it. I want to, go out and prove that I didn't. I don't know. I mean, I go back and forth all the time about whether she did it or not. But there is a book. When I was filming this, I said to my dad, well, she had to do it because, what are the chances that, like, this random person comes in and axes these people to death? And he said, oh, well, there's this book, and I can't remember the name of it, but you can probably look it up by Googling just roughly what I'm saying. But there was these writers recently discovered that there was this axe murderer who was traveling through America on trains and actually breaking into people's homes. It was at the turn of the 20th century, and doing this, he was killing them with an axe, and it was these brutal murders, and he'd lay the bodies out in a very distinct way. And the reason why these writers were able to and by the way, people in these towns there were people who were accused of doing these murders, and some of them were executed on the basis of it, I believe. But this guy got away with it because he was traveling by train. It was random. He was picking these locations seemingly by random. So I just wonder if, like, Lizzie Borden, I think that was 1892, 1893. Is this like a precursor? Like, could it have been this, this random person?
Oh.
Because this was sort of, we're talking like very turn of the 20th century that this guy was murdering. And these writers, they discovered this by linking all these newspaper articles, and kind of, they put this mystery together, and it's a very bizarre story. So when I called my dad and I was like, well, it's got to be Lizzie Borden, because, like, who else is going in murdering people with axes, which, by the way, is such a personal crime? And he was like, well, there's this guy in the 20th century that was going around just, like, randomly axing people in their houses. So there you go, another book for your maybe for your podcast.
Okay, no, but that it's like some sort, almost like a Jack the Ripper-esque, like, yeah, and it would just be shielded by something else.
Jack the Ripper is unknowable. I mean, we're never going to know who he was. I don't think that there's, a huge, I mean, there's just no way to really know. But the reason why we keep going back to it is because we don't know. Ripper was horrible, and what he did was horrible. But there's also, like, this debate about, were these even the first crimes of his? Because they were so violent. One has to think that maybe there were some precursors that were less violent, and he starts to ramp up. So, for instance, in the medical records in Whitechapel, in some of these hospitals, you will get a case of a person, for instance, around the Ripper times, where it says that they committed suicide by taking their own life by cutting their throat to the vertebrae. Nobody can do that. I mean, as far as I know, that would be a very difficult thing to do to yourself. So you look at that and you think, well, that had to have been a murder. Was this sort of an early example of a Ripper murder? And things kind of, ramp up, because some of these cases, they fit the kind of profile of who he was looking, women who were on the street, who were homeless. So it's an interesting thing, but I think it's one of those mysteries we'll never know, but we just keep going back to because it's unknowable.
I've always said on this podcast, like, the one thing I like is You know, I love to find people who've written things that I'm interested in, but above all else, I love to talk to people who are passionate about anything. I had on a guy that has a laser printing or a laser clean, they clean printers, but I loved it because he just loved it. You radiate like this is what you're passionate about, and I think that's fucking
So,
beautiful. Like you
thank you.
you light up with like, let me go in and tell you about this guy who drove into the trenches in a Rolls Royce. Like
Yeah.
that's
Let me tell you about the
incredible.
guy who lost his testicle in the 19th century. Yeah,
No, but
I get
seriously,
very excited about these stories, but I'm very, thank you for saying that, because I'm very passionate about sharing my very weird knowledge, spending, I have no practical skills whatsoever. I can't do anything, but I
me
can tell
neither.
you all these weird stories about the past. So that's what I end up doing. But it's been such a joy to talk to you. And I hope I can come back and talk to you about the
A
next book.
100%. You don't have a choice. But I was gonna say, no, but that's, if you tried to write a book on the history of shoes, you'd probably be like, fuck this. But that's why I think the butchering art's so good, is you clearly love it. Like you clearly love
I
it.
love
And that's what evokes this imagery of the three-piece suit just chopping up people and a horse-drawn carriage. And it's just like
it. Yeah.
nothing, who knows? There's no such thing as germs. Fuck it. I think there's something beautiful about that. And
Well, maybe when I come back, there'll be a news about a movie. That's always my dream. I joke that I'm trying to go into Hollywood as a total outsider and say, you need to make a movie about this guy you've never heard of,
you do.
except through the product Listerine, which, guys, remember, it was used to treat gonorrhea. It was not used as a mouthwash in the 19th century. I don't endorse that, but there you go. That's the way history is.
That's I honestly I think it would be incredible. And everyone, I highly, again, the biggest compliment I can give it is I listened to this book before I started the podcast. I listened to it because I wanted to. So take from that what you will. I think everyone, they know I've recommended books on this podcast a million times. This is one of the few books I can. This, Raven Rock, and Operation Paperclip. Those are three books that I listened to before the podcast, and I don't think anything else. So I highly recommend those, and I
Thank
can't
you.
wait to talk to you for your next book. And I will let you go because I know you need to eat, and I can keep talking to you forever, but I will
I
let
know,
you
me
go.
too. This was great fun. Thanks for chasing me down, and I was alive, and I'm glad that we were able to schedule this. So hopefully
I
we can
got it.
schedule
It took a while, but persistence, it worked. I got you, and
Yep, it
that's
did
one in the
work.
win column. Thank you so
Yep.
much. I'll put all your stuff in the description, guys. I highly, highly, highly recommend it. The narrator's incredible. Does all the perfect accents. It's disgusting. You'll throw up probably. You'll also laugh your ass off, and you'll appreciate modern day medicine like you never have before. Miss Lindsey Fitzharris, thank you so
Thank,
much. Take
thank you.
care. You have a good one.